Good evening again. Glad that you're here, that you found a place to park. And the only question I had was going to ask Marty before he got away, but do we need to put signs up Saturday over on their lot for our trick or treat? For our trick or trunk? Okay, that being said, we're glad that you are here tonight. We're going to finish up what we started last week on capital punishment. And if we have any time left, we'll move into our next topic. But we'll see what we can do tonight in this particular case. I appreciate the comments and all the things that you guys contribute back as well, your thoughts. I was thinking over the week about it and about how we have our opinions and our beliefs pretty much locked in. But I'm giving you both sides, hopefully, so that you'll be able to maybe waive the other side of what you believe and see if there's a balance in there somewhere where maybe you guys, we won't be so much at each other's throats over our opinions and our beliefs that this is what's right, and so that's it. So maybe we can eliminate that and approach it more with love for our brothers, as Jesus promised probably that Jesus told us that we should be doing. So let's go on and get into it here. This is where we left off, was rehabilitation. And I think Robert last week said, there are some cases where people can't be rehabilitized, but their belief in rehabilitation is no capital punishment for any crime. It doesn't make any difference what it is. We put them in jail. We never kill anyone over their crime. So we're going to go in and see what it says. And the New Testament love, according to one side, says it rules out capital punishment. And they use the scripture of Matthew 5:44. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. So that is one argument. The reply to that, now this is what I'm saying, it's kind of a yin-yang kind of thing. It's, here's one eye, here's the other eye. There's no greater love they also use for John 15:13 than you can give up for your brother. There's the reply. Love and capital punishment are not contrary. The very principle of the two that uses John 3:16, of course, we know that one. 1 Peter 3:18, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. The very principle of the two are fundamental in the story of the cross, a life for a life. Jesus' life for ours, for each one of us individually. And I think sometimes we gloss over that as far as Jesus living and giving his life for me personally. I think we think about it in the general sense, but do you really stop and think that he died for me? If there wasn't anybody else in the world, it would be just me that he died for. The next argument, the cross was capital punishment for all men, talking about Jesus' death. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. So again, this is the thoughts on not having capital punishment. Here's the opposite side. Cross was the capital. The cross was the capital punishment for all men. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. Romans 5:10. Sin brings death. We've known that since the Garden of Eden. Jesus died for all, therefore the death penalty was done away with. For your consideration. The cross did not abolish capital punishment. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, Hebrews 9:27. We all must die. Jesus died for us, but we still have to die. But the death is not the end. This is where we come into that fact. That'll be an argument a little bit later on the breath of God. We'll talk about in just a few moments. So retributionism is a different thing than what we were looking at with rehabilitation. The retribution is their point of view is death for some crimes is okay and for others it's not okay. And they have to decide which one that is. Views on capital punishment is as legitimate for some crimes, namely the capital crimes, those that are like of murder or well, what else is there besides murder? I'm thinking of a capital crime. I'm sure there are others, but that's the one that comes to mind when they talk about capital crime. If they have, the punishment is the same. In other words, if you have I'm sorry?
Kidnapping.
Oh, okay. Kidnapping, you're right. That's a capital punishment, capital crime. But what they're saying is like it would be equal for one. If it's a little crime, you don't punish them. If it's a big crime, you punish them. The crime would balance out with what the punishment would be. Retributionists believe the capital punishment is to punish. It's not because we want to take a life or because we want to feel like we're in charge. They think it's to punish. They don't believe that civil governments should be bound by Mosaic legislation on capital punishment. Thou shalt not kill. That's where they look at that and say, no, well, that shouldn't bind us to not having the capital punishment laws. They advocate that the criminal is not sick, but sinful. And you see so many criminals when they're fine until it comes time to get caught and they go before the judge and suddenly they're not mentally capable anymore. We see that an awful lot. Since he, being rational and morally responsible and knows right from wrong, he deserves to be punished. Again, that's one side. God instituted human government and gave it capital authority for the purpose of dealing with capital crimes. And they use Genesis 9, chapter 9, verses 5 and 6. Excuse me. Let me change my sheet here. The medication I'm taking gives me cotton mouth, and I go to lick my finger to pick up a paper, and it don't work. There's nothing there. So, the capital punishment, they say, is reaffirmed in the New Testament. And they look at these scriptures. I won't go into all of them, but if you want to write them down, you can. Romans 13:4, John 19:11, and Acts 25:11. And if you're still using your worksheet from last week, you notice those are in New Testaments in red and underlined. That's still some of your answers off of the quiz there. So we continue with the additional moral arguments. This is all, again, finishing up our capital punishment. The moral arguments include capital punishment is unjustly applied. A disappropriate number of minorities are given corporal punishment. We see that all the time. Oh, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. I got one under here, but I didn't get to it yet. So a disappropriate number of minorities are given corporal punishment. The other side of that answers back and says, unequal justice does not negate the need for justice. Inequality should be addressed, but not abolish justice altogether. Percentages don't rule justice. So you can't say, well, there's more of one race than the other race, so we need to punish them equally. Well, you can't do that. You have to punish those that commit the crime by what, by the punishment that goes along with it. And you guys can feel free to comment anytime you want. If you don't agree with any of these things, that's okay. Or if you do. It's not a deterrent to crime, capital punishment. It may encourage it, in fact, by giving state sanction to the violent taking of life. Capital crimes still continue, even though we are taking lives daily. We took one last week from I forgot his name now already, but they put him to death last Thursday. And there are many people say, well, that didn't cure anything. Yeah, Marty?
However, the problem is not that capital punishment does not deter crime. It's that by the time we put anybody to death, it's been so long that nobody even knows what they did anymore, except the people who are directly involved. If crimes were committed worthy of death and they were killed within 2 weeks after an appropriate trial, people would stand up and take notice. I'm almost certain of that.
That's very true. In my judgment, and this is strictly my opinion, when we have capital punishment that's been gone through the courts and tried, I'm like you, with 2 weeks it'd be fine. We would give that much time to a rabid dog to make sure it was rabies, and then we would take him out. And I kind of consider sometimes some of these crimes that are so horrid that they're, you'd rather have a mad dog than you would have them people around. But again, that's my opinion, yes.
Give the perpetrator of the crime all this time on TV. They go through and interview him, they interview the family members, and half of this is busting heads and go back to a second grade teacher and try to find out what's wrong with this guy. Don't give them any publicity, and then they won't have their 15 minutes of fame, and just do like Marty said, 2 weeks, boom, you're gone.
Yeah. Our justice system is set up so that we hopefully, can get a fair trial. That's what we wanted to do in this country, and I think that was what was originally intended. But now we have so many loopholes and amendments that they can go and appeal, and here, and they appeal there, and they appeal here, and like you said, it's on TV with all the families and all that. So by the time they do, you forget that what they did, almost, because it takes so long. The guy they did last Thursday, I think, was in there for like 20 years before they executed him, and that's kind of silly. Back in the back.
Just a comment.
Okay.
Used to, Lady Justice wore a blindfold so she could dispense justice evenly and fairly. But for the last 50 or so years, she wore that blindfold because she can't stand to see what's happening to the justice system.
All right. Did everybody hear that? Okay. Well, somebody over here had a hand up too. Back there.
Yeah, in China,
Oh, there it is.
in China, you don't have 2 weeks. You found guilty, you're gone in 7 days. That way you get your family and your whatever together and then say goodbye. And also the real crime to somebody being in prison for 22 years is the lawyers use them for something, for a money pit. You follow the money trail, it always goes to the lawyers. How many times is that lawyer up there? Oh, we got to do this. Oh, we got to do that. And this is the state paying this lawyer because it's, oh boy, they killed somebody.
I know that lawyers are partly responsible for the problem because they make a law and then they make another one to amend that law, and so you're going through all these laws. And another opinion I'd always had was if they make one law, they ought to take 2 off the books. And that way we might get down to where it's reasonably to decipher what they want to do. Back here, I think, John, did you have, anybody else had one hand up back here? I don't remember where it was now. Kim?
Just kind of throwing this out there. This is a very emotional subject for a lot of people. That's probably why you're bringing it up. Good for you. But do you think that some of the emotion might be tied to a misunderstanding of who's carrying out the justice? I mean, personally, I don't want to put anyone to death. I never want that responsibility. So on that side of it, yeah, I don't like it. But on the other side of it, you've given several scriptures, Romans 13 being one, where it's very clear that the government bears a sword, not a blanket and a pillow, for a reason, right? I mean, some of the emotion is that people think, well, it's me carrying this out to execute. It's not me carrying out the execution, right? It's the authorities which have their right given to them by God.
Well, it's also because people make choices, and we can't feel responsible for the choice they made to commit a crime. And I think that's where we kind of go off rail, is we all feel responsible that this poor person has committed a crime and they have to do something with society. Well, not all of us. They make choices, and I think we need to look at that.
The idea of capital punishment with the scriptures, I think that's pretty easy to support. The reason why I would maybe say, with the current justice system that we have now, the corruption that we have, systemic corruption, I would be scared to give them that much power to be able to execute people in 2 weeks, because then it can turn into a witch hunt, and anybody that doesn't work with the government, man, if you've got an express lane to liquidate that person, they're going to use it in the wrong way. That would be my concern with the fast track. But if the evidence is there, it's compelling, it's a closed case, definitely not for dragging it on for 20 years. Forget that garbage. But with our current justice system, the way people use it, I've heard several people make comments about how, Lady Justice with the blindfold, I think that's pretty accurate. Other comments about, how corrupt it is. Well, for that reason, maybe we need more than 2 weeks until we could somehow get the justice system doing what it was designed to do, but it's not.
You mean you think there's actual corruption in the government? I'm just, that's another class, right? Becky, you had something you wanted to say?
I think that we all agree that it's not necessarily capital punishment that we have issues with, but it's the judicial system itself and how to get to that idea. But until you actually sat on the jury and knowing that this will all is capital punishment and have to sit guilty until innocent, it's very hard, and that Christian ethics comes out in the journals. So it's difficult to sit in that position.
Yeah, and I would really hate to be called in on a jury that was on a murder case. I think I would do everything I could. Oh, okay. Generally, she was saying that we have not been in that situation to where we had to make that judgment call. And as a result, things are different. So, did I get it about right? Or halfway? Okay. Right, we haven't sat on a capital. In fact, I haven't sat on a traffic ticket. I've been called in a couple of times, but they didn't like me and sent me on out of the way. So, since it was about cars and I was working at General Motors, they didn't want me. I don't know why, but back in the back.
So I agree that we can find scripture to support, and we can find scripture to love, and we discuss it. And the big problem I see is the application. If you murder somebody and the crime is capital punishment, shouldn't it be capital punishment every time? And if, as our laws and rules that we've established through representation or through voting, it would be nice to have that unilateral application. For example, I had a best friend murdered with a claw hammer. She was 16. and about 4 months pregnant by her boyfriend, who was scared that she was going to rat him out to the police. And he got out of prison after 20 years on parole. Is that fair? His kid's life, a young lady's life. But then you've got this gentleman last week who was put to death for taking the life of his child. In both instances, somebody lost a life. Happened about 20 years ago. But that rule was not consistently applied. And the different cases we make for, is it rehabilitation, is it retribution, is it morally, it's hard to sit and listen and talk about this when it's not so cut in black and white. If you take a life, do you take that person's life, or do we not take that life? And I think if we can come down and say, this is what we're going to do, for better or worse, and start a plan, that if you take a life, then your life is taken with intent. I mean, somebody has a car wreck, accidentally kills somebody, manslaughter or something. But with that intent, then I think some of these conversations might make a little bit more sense in an ethics case, but we can't even apply the rules.
Yeah. Well, that's true. It runs even back into the Old, if you go back into the Old Testament, if someone committed murder, if they got to the altar and had their hands wrapped on the horn, then they couldn't punish them until they went to court. They had to have a trial. And, but if they didn't make it, then it was kind of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So there was that aspect of it too, that they were talking about. They didn't want to follow up with that Mosaic law. We want to throw that out because of that. That's one of the reasons. Back in the back.
Sorry,
Charles,
I
that's
can't.
okay.
My wife and I disagree on this. In certain
Just
situations,
this, you're lucky.
in certain situations, I used to work for the drug court program, helping to rehabilitate people with substance abuse problems who had committed crimes. And I knew a gentleman who, while in our program, committed a violent crime and got life in prison. And I knew the judge. And I've spoken to the judge many times, and he told me once, mental health is such a big factor, and I'm not trying to sound crude when I say this, but he said it just like this. He said, I have to be able to put my gavel down and decide whether that person is evil or crazy. Mental health is such a huge issue because he did have substance abuse issues and his brain was fried and he made decisions he may not have made otherwise. And what if he had a psychotic episode at that particular time? He had to factor in all that. It's so infinitely complicated. And that's not even to include the people, I'm sorry, it's not even to include the people who literally can't help. Their brain chemistry is off by a milligram, so they think people are trying to get them. And how do you, it's just mental health is so complicated, and from what I can read, it's not really an issue that was addressed in the Old Testament. If you did it, you were guilty, you were punished. That being said, I think it's more complicated than that now. And that's all I have to say.
You mentioned the fact that there wasn't an example. I think about the example of someone going mad when you think about Nebuchadnezzar. And I mean, he was out eating grass and had his, it was covered with hair. It was all matted and all this stuff because God had said, you're gonna go crazy because you're taking this is gonna be your punishment.
Oh, and you'll notice they all left him alone.
I'm sorry?
They all left him alone out there. They didn't mess with the crazy naked guy.
Yeah. And I don't know, like I said, it's not an easy subject. That's why I got it in here for you to kind of think about, study on, and look at, because it's something we're faced with in our society. We're faced with this every so often, where someone comes up for trial for murder. Back over here. Can't see who it is.
The term capital crime in the state of Oklahoma includes 3 crimes: murder, rape, or robbery. You don't see the rapists or the robbers get death. You see some of the murderers get death. That's it in Oklahoma. The judge does not set, he doesn't decide guilty and not guilty unless the accused decides to have the judge do it. The jury decides. The jury decides the punishment. The district attorney determines what the punishment can be, like range, whether it can be life without, or death. I was on a murder trial in 1998. I was a juror. I was the foreman of the jury. The man's dead. Okay? Roll some years forward to 2007. My brother was murdered. Murdered in the first degree. But capital punishment was not an option. The jury had the option of manslaughter, life, and life without. They gave him life. That's 38 years and 3 months in Oklahoma. He can't get out before then. You know, you just have to read and study it, you know. But anyway, I just had to give it up there. The jury found him guilty, and they gave him life, and I accepted that. The jury that I was on, we gave him death. I was the foreman of the jury. My name's on it. Mine's the only name on it. You know, it is complicated. But now, another thing, too, you know, I was very skeptical of the court system. The guy got a fair trial. The guy that killed my brother got a fair trial. And the guy that killed this kid from Spencer over here, that I was on the jury, he got a fair trial. So I kind of been there.
Yeah. You've had more experience than most of us have on that then, so, back here.
I just want to say, I think a lot of that depends on what side you're on, such as he spoke of. I've had an uncle that was murdered, beat to death with a squeegee by mentally ill 23-year-olds. Nothing ever happened to him. You know, on the other hand, we've been to the prison ministry where we've got people doing life for drugs. And so, you know, then you put yourself in the other situation. What if your daughter's driving down the road, she hits somebody and kills them by accident, and somebody says, no, it was on purpose. We want life, we want death penalty straight across the board. So it's, you know, it depends on which side of that you're on. My sister's husband was murdered by a boyfriend of his daughter, right in front of them. Nothing happened to them because he was mentally ill. He certainly isn't in prison, and he's certainly not behind bars, and he's certainly not receiving treatment. So it's kind of hard to determine just, you know, how your feelings are with that. So I think it's like he said, it depends on which side that you're looking at.
Well, and what you say is true. The belief and ethics that we have would be what is our standard, if you would, if we're on that jury. It's going to influence us the way we are. That's why they choose 12 people, different people. Supposedly they're peers, you know, and they have to make a tough decision. But when, you know, there's some that are no-brainers to me. You know, I mean, they got, some guy goes in and the guy that ran through the parade, in fact, he's saw that tonight on the news, that he was coming up for trial, and you see him running through that parade, running over people, and you think, you know, there's no doubt. Why do we have to drag this thing out for 20 years? And regardless, you know, but then there are people who say, well, yeah, but he needs that fair trial and all the appeals before, we should do anything to him. So it's kind of a yin-yang all the time that we're doing, so.
There are two sides to each subject, and that's where it's kind of rare, and not everything is always black and white. Because you can take the Bible and justify your Christian ethics either way.
Yes, and what she said, in case you didn't hear back there, was that there's always the black and white sides, and one's going to go one way, one's going to go the other way, and we don't seem to see any gray areas most of the time in the middle. It's either my way or the highway kind of attitudes, and when actually we should be able to say, well, yeah, there is a case where this is okay, or there's a case where it's not okay, but not based on necessarily our prejudice, but based on what actually happened. Like I said, a guy going through that parade, there's no doubt, to me, be a mad dog type thing, you take him out of his misery, kind of thing. Rebecca, speak up a little bit. I couldn't hardly hear you last time.
When I was in prison, I heard really interesting stories. This one gentleman, he goes and he says he was in a convenience store, and in the convenience store, they have a place where they can look down on people in the store. He says this guy jumped up and took the money from him, jumped down, run out the door. He chased him out the door and shot him in the back. Okay, that's a no-no, because he was not providing a dangerous situation. The cop come. They knew this person in the convenience store because they dealt with him, bought stuff off of him. The cop took what they call a throwaway gun that has no serial numbers on it, anything, and he threw it down to where the kid, I'm going to say kid, was killed. Therefore, this kid had a gun, which made it okay for him to shoot because he was in danger of his life. And the cop,
Let's move on and see what else we can stir up here before we get done.
one tiny thing. The cop says, this
Oh,
only
I'm
happens.
sorry.
The cop
I
says,
told you I couldn't hear it, so.
the cop says, this only happens one time. We don't do it for you again. And it was interesting that all of this went down in a matter of 20 minutes or less by the time the cops got there and everything, that he actually killed somebody that was running away from the scene of a crime. And the cops actually was a judge who saved his.
I apologize. I hope everybody else can hear that, because even though my hearing aid's not working, I guess.
That's it.
Did I get you all done? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Hopefully I didn't, cut you off. I didn't mean to be. The reply makes one realize there will be severe consequences for their actions. The threat of going to jail and being executed should be deterrent enough, I guess, in their case. A life for a life seems to be a balance of justice. Some will commit crimes regardless. And we see that all the time. I mean, how many shootings have been in the last 2 weeks? I mean, everywhere. It's just crazy. It doesn't make sense to me. And whether we got the death penalty or whether we don't have the death penalty, there's something wrong in our society that we need to be finding out where. In addition to the biblical arguments, several moral arguments are included, and we'll go with these. Capital punishment is an inhumane form of punishment. How many times have we heard that? In fact, they stopped it in Oklahoma so they could check out the drugs that they were using because they thought it might be causing them pain when they die. And, I could go into a whole spiel with that one right there, But I won't. I'll keep my opinions to myself and let you guys do that. Do it, Johnny? It's not an acceptable argument to me either, but cruel, unusual punishment is in the extreme, they say, and the answer to that, or at least the opposite side, is it affirms human dignity, which was a strange answer for me to see that. But they said the fact that God places such a high price tag on human life, taking a life is the value he places on human dignity. So he wants to, that's their retort to that. Criminals should be cured, not killed. That sounds like a sign, doesn't it, that somebody would be marching with, really. But social illness, which needs to be treated. They need a doctor, not a funeral director, a psychiatrist, or an executioner. So I'm looking to see if anybody was going to argue. Not yet, anyway, huh? Prisoners are not patients, they are persons. This is the opposite side of that. Yeah, Marty?
I want to point out that phraseology, social illness. Cancer is not a social illness. You have it or you don't. Immorality is not an illness. You practice it or you don't. Nobody commits adultery because they are socially ill. I understand this idea of mental illness, but that idea of social illness, that gets back to what I think Nisi was addressing, that anytime anybody does anything wrong, we automatically accept the burden of guilt on ourselves because we're part of a society that produced them, and that's just wrong. And there's nothing biblical to support that. When we choose to do wrong, that's on us. It would be wrong for me to blame my parents for the way I am today. That's on me. And it's on you. It's on everybody else. Circumstances influences, but the law remains the same. God's law remains the same. And I think back about Genesis 9. I apologize, I wasn't in class last week. I wasn't able to be in class. I was doing something else while I was here. But what God tells Noah and his family when they get off the ark is, if anybody kills anybody else, you're supposed to kill them. And they were the only people there. There wasn't anybody, it was just the 8 of them. And he told them that. But if you go back to chapter 6, twice in chapter 6, he references how violent the world had become. And I believe his statement to Noah and his family in chapter 9 was based on the violence of chapter 6. Listen, guys, I had to destroy the whole world because things got out of hand. And so I'm telling you, when there is murder, you put the murderer to death, and you, like Barney Fife would say, 5,000 years later, nip it in the bud. So, and that's the same thing Solomon said. I'm sorry, I'm preaching the sermon here. He said when sentence against an evil work is not carried out speedily, the hearts of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. And you can see that in any second grade classroom. Teacher walks out and things start to get out of hand. Nobody comes in to settle them down. Not one second grader is going to say, you know what, guys, we really ought to get quiet and get back to our work. And all of humanity is just like that. If justice is not carried out, it's just going to get worse. And I think that's what we're seeing in our society today. It's worse because justice has not been carried out. Mental illness notwithstanding. So there's my sermon.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. It reminds me of my school bus, but they won't let me have capital punishment for that. But my second graders get out of hand, but you have to go back and settle them down. And like Kim said a while ago about, God instituted governments to wield the sword, and that's why we have government. When the government fails to wield the sword, we're in a lot of trouble, and I think that's part of it. Got one back here, Preston? Was that you? Yeah.
A comment about what Marty said. I agree with that. That's a lot of the problems with our society. that things are not addressed and let go, then it festers, and it becomes more and more embedded into our society, and it just keeps growing. We don't do anything about it. And as far as the mental illness, that's a whole different can of worms. I don't really know enough to comment on the mental illness side of it. I know it's a problem. I know that people deal with it every day. I've thought about it. It completely exhausts me mentally to try to come up with a solution. It's so complicated, it just wears me out thinking about it. And I know these people live with this every day. And you want to help them, but you don't know how. You just have to be there and hope that you can make their lives as good as you can while they're here. And not to cause any trouble, but try to help them when you can.
Well, as Christian people, we're supposed to be a forgiving people. And we can be, but even God, like, when Marty pointed out a while ago, when it got so bad that he had, said, mercy's run out, guys. We can't, you're going too crazy with this. Yeah, Don, one more. I think I heard the bill.
Okay. I'm forgiving all these crazy people and send them over to your house. So what do you do then?
What was the last part? I didn't catch it.
We'll send them all over to your house because they got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Now, you quantify lost. Who's lost? Everybody, whether you have mental illness or not. Now, are we responsible? Are we responsible if we have mental illness? Is the person that does something that doesn't have the mental faculty to make the decision of whether to do right or wrong, are they responsible? Is an adult that doesn't reach what we call the age of accountability, does something wrong, are they responsible? Or are we responsible for them? I think that we are responsible for them. That's one of the reasons God put us here, is to try to help those around us.
When we're dealing, though, with the mental illness, you're running into a kind of a gray area, because you can't, there's not a test that say you can go in and say, okay, write this down and we know that you're mentally ill or you're not. And with the drug systems that we have now, that we have flowing out on the streets, they can be to the point to where they may be mentally ill for this period of time when they commit the crime, and then they're fine and normal afterwards. So it can be even drug induced, but we don't know until it's tried. Marty?
Just to avoid some internal confusion and conflict, there are two levels of authority. First is my authority as an individual, and then there's the authority of government. I am not given the authority to carry out justice on anyone. My responsibility is to forgive in as much as I can forgive and live at peace with others, but the government doesn't have the freedom to forgive like that. The government's responsibility, they are mandated for justice. And if I'm in government and I see there's an individual who is, let's say, mentally ill to the point where he's committed murder, my responsibility is not so much to him as it is to the public, the people I'm governing, to keep them safe from this individual. If that means putting him to death, that's one thing. It might mean putting him in a place where he cannot escape and get anybody else. But my responsibility is to the citizens at large. If I'm in government, and I've been given the responsibility as government by God to bear the sword so that evil people will be afraid and good people will be rewarded. But as an individual, my attitude should be the same as Christ on the cross. Forgive them. But we should be able to count on the government, that's where the failure comes sometimes, to carry out justice in spite of our willingness to forgive. I know that sounds like the second in a series of sermons.
We you said it reminded me of the fact that Caesar, with Jesus, when his trial, Jesus said he wouldn't have that power to condemn me if God hadn't give it to you. But that didn't change the fact of what he did. He went ahead and condemned him to death, even though he was an innocent man. And so that, that was our second bell, I think. So, yeah. Answer to 6. I don't have one of those with me. I will look at it just a minute. So. More arguments are used by what? Oh. Johnny, you got something to close with?
I think there's a broader spectrum, and one of them is spiritual, and one of them is physical. When somebody is executed, they are not forbidden to repent of sins and make it right with God, so to speak. Some things you can't make right with people.
Jeffrey Dahmer comes to mind.
Yeah, you can't bring that back, can't correct it. But when someone's executed, we're not removing their ability to be right with God. We're not forever cursing them. We're not sending them to hell necessarily, even if we think they deserve it. But
that's one of the arguments I got.
And I think we tangle the two together sometimes.
You talk about going to hell. There's one I want to stop us here just a second, but capital punishment will send unbelievers to hell. Said if God is long suffering, not willing that any should perish, should we not be so? One could never repent, he was killed first. And like I said, I think about Jeffrey Dahmer when with all of the horrible things that he did, and yet he claimed that he met a member of the church and was converted and baptized and was forgiven. A lot of our members will tell you no, he wasn't. A lot of them will say yes, he was. So that's the way it kind of is. And I'm over time, guys. Can you hold your questions till the next week? Because I'm already going to be in trouble. I'm 5 minutes past time anyway. So, but thank you for your attention. We'll cover those last couple of questions maybe when we get back. And then we get into a really a non-debatable or non-arguable question on abortion. We'll do that next. So.